I'll tell you a little bit about how my work with youth developed. I was working happily in Sydney, Australia, at Macquarie University, and I got a call from La Trobe University in Melbourne to take up a position as a lecturer in Australian literature. We also snuck some New Zealand literature, you'll be pleased to know, onto the course. Janet Frame, Frank Sargison, James K. Baxter, these wonderful people. The guy who wrote Once for Warriors, Alan Duff, yeah, so on. So, you know, across the ditch, we have a great deal of things in common and some unity. And when I first took up the job, I was a tutor. And tutors aren't allowed to lecture because they're not important enough to give lectures. So I just did tutorials, and the students would come back from lectures and say, well, we've just had a lecture on James K. Baxter, or we've just had a lecture on Janet Frame, or Patrick White, or Les Murray. And the spiritual side of these writers was completely ignored in the lectures. And I said, well, what do you expect? We're in an atheist university. You know, they're not going to go there. And the students made it clear to me that they were sick and tired of being in an atheist university, and they'd rather that the spirit and the spiritual side of literature be honoured and acknowledged. And of course, that put me in an awkward situation because I didn't want to start arguing with my superiors about how to interpret literature, because they were all atheists, humanists, Marxists, feminists, and so on. But after a few years of this, I thought, you know, as soon as I got tenure, which I did in 1987, not that it means anything these days, but it meant something then, I thought, well, I'm going to start developing a course on spirituality. Because if the students want it, well then let's make sure they get it. And so I started this course, which I called Spirituality and Rites of Passage. And it wasn't part of formally the literature department. It was one of those what we call cognate courses, or standalone courses, which was an optional extra. I think the word is elective or something like that. I don't know. I'm not keen on bureaucracy and language like that. But anyway, lots of students came to it. And I really wanted to find out what spirituality meant for them, because, you know, my head was in the clouds of academia. I really wasn't conscious of what they meant by spirituality. Of course, with my background, I knew what it meant in the Christian church, but I felt sure that wasn't precisely what they were meaning when they said, we want to have spirituality included in the curriculum. And so I began to discuss it with colleagues, and as you can imagine, there was no interest in it whatsoever. And when the course was finally passed on the basis that, oh, he's got a bee in the bonnet, let him do it, you know, and give him enough rope and the bastard will hang himself, you know. And when it was passed at a staff meeting, all the staff said, you know, if you're ever sick with a flu or a virus, don't expect us to stand in for you. If you're sick, the course just gets shelved. I mean, there'll be nobody standing up taking your place. And I said, okay, all right, well, thanks for being so collegial, helpful. And discussing it with colleagues over morning tea, very civilised thing we used to do, I found, of course, they were very suspicious. And one colleague, a senior lecturer in my area, said that he thought the course would probably draw two kinds of people. The very religious, who would present problems of intellectual rigidity, and he said they are Teflon coated. I said, what do you mean? Because I've never heard that quip before. He means nothing will stick to them. They already know the answers because they've got, they've got these hardened religious ideas. There's so much jaundiced prejudice about religious people in the non-religious world. And then he said, plus you'll get New Agers rocking up in large numbers, and they will present problems of flakiness. Because there's nothing between the ears. You know? So he said, the religious right and the New Age oddballs will sign up to your course. By the beginning of the course, I was trembling, actually. Yeah. What on earth have I done? Perhaps I've done something really stupid, you know. But I hadn't. And in fact, the majority of students who did join the course were, you might just call, normal. Or as one student said, the new normal. Which I thought was a nice little quip. It did attract some students from faith traditions, but these were mostly, as you'll see from this campus here at the University of Waikato, a lot of the students on campus are overseas students, particularly during the summer months. The local kids go back home during the summer, but a lot of the overseas students have a short visit back, but usually they can't afford to go back to Singapore or China or India or Pakistan or wherever they're from. So they often hang out in the campus. And I had a lot of students from Islamic tradition, from Hindu, Buddhist, and as one student said, real Buddhists. And I thought, what does that mean? And what he meant was people from Buddhist countries who actually were brought up Buddhists, not just those who had defected from the Catholic Church. One of my students made an interesting quip and said, I asked them at the start of the class what their background was, and one student said, I'm lapsed Catholic, of course. I said, why, of course? And he said, well, lapsed Catholic is the biggest religion in the world. So, you know, we had lots of fun like this. The media became interested. We had, I think, 3 television shows, which wasn't really good. Because, you know, as some of you have been saying during the week, the course got so successful that envy went through the roof. My colleagues thought, my God, you know, he's getting huge numbers, you know, as large as what's in this room today or even bigger. And it's on something that we don't agree with. And plus he's got television coming here, you know, to add insult to injury. And Geraldine Doog and Compass came down about twice, and Rachel Conn was there with the spirit of things. Sorry if New Zealanders don't understand, but these are important media people in Australia. Even Philip Adams became interested, thinking, what on earth's going on? What kind of cult is he leading down there in Melbourne? And we had a lot of fun for 10 years. But I think that in addition to the religious groups that I mentioned before, the majority of the students were secular, or as the lovely Anglican bishop said, apparently secular. I love that. Helen Ann, yeah. Hart, wasn't it? Helen Ann Hart. I'm sorry, I'm terrible on names. And they were apparently secular. But as Jacques Derrida says, secularism is simply a mask that the modern world wears. Underneath, we all have religious lives, whether we admit them or not. Mostly people don't admit them. And as Jacques Derrida famously said, an atheist is a believer in waiting. And I thought of Malcolm Muggeridge, the famous case in Britain, and also our Philip Adams. I'm expecting a call any minute saying, sorry, David, I've been giving you hell all these years, but actually I've now converted. You know. I take the idea that we were made in the image of God very seriously. It's not just an intellectual idea. To me, it's a virtually biological fact. And as such, whether we are called religious or not, there is religious urge there, religious desire. The famous Latin motto has it, called or not called, God is always present. And in Australia, and probably New Zealand, although I shouldn't presume to know too much about this country, God is mostly not called. but nevertheless present. And what I found about this course was that so long as I avoided religious language, which I tell you what was extremely difficult, because as someone steeped in religion, I had to train my mind to not talk about God, to not talk about Jesus, especially in the presence of Islamic and Jewish students, to try and find a language. Now, don't you think that's the hardest thing on earth, is to find a spiritual language to talk to secular people who have, and often atheists, who have got all sorts of prejudices about religion, and you know that there's a God element in them. If you could only reach in and touch it, they would come alive. But if you reach in with religious language, they'll push you away and say, look, you're trying to convert me, you're being evangelical, you're proselytizing, etc., etc. It's a fine line. We have to try and awaken people's spiritual potential, spiritual lives, without alienating them by imposing a language. Now, the dear old Catholic Church got interested in this, and I had Archbishop of Melbourne come to my course, Frank Little, and he said, oh, I'm scratching my head. He said, you're doing this without using God language. And I said, well, if I used God language, all the students would get up and walk out. Frankly, this is frontier territory. But he said, but aren't you winning them for the church? And I said, no, not really. And he said, why not? He said, we need young people. And I said, I know you need young people, but I need them to stay in my lecture halls. So we had all sorts of bizarre conversations about this. And he said, yes, but... Oh, and then he scratched his head. He said, perhaps what you're doing, this is Frank Little, perhaps what you're doing is pre-evangelization. And I've actually agreed with him. It is. I said, I'm tilling the soil so that the seeds, which are already being sown in them by God, can come to birth. And he said, but how do you do that? And I said, well, that's what I'm trying to figure out myself. I don't have any teachers, I don't have any mentors, but I have a strong personal desire, and I'm going to try and figure it out. Now, I made a few errors, and I regret that, but look, you learn from your errors. In the first couple of years, I set John O'Donoghue, as some of you, I've been seeing, some of you have some of his work, like Anam Cara. And John O'Donoghue's view, excuse me, is that nature is graced with the presence of God. It's like the Gerard Manley Hopkins poem, God's Grandeur. And what I didn't know at the time was that John O'Donoghue was having struggles with his bishops in Ireland. I didn't know that till I met him personally later. So in order to understand where John O'Donoghue was coming from with the so-called creation theology or creation spirituality, I discussed the fall and redemption model, which of course is the orthodox model of Christianity. And I tried to put to them what the Adam and Eve story meant in symbolic terms. I, of course, was careful not to take the creation story literally. And I talked about the role of Christ in redeeming that fall from grace that we see in Genesis. And 2 or 3 lines, whole lines of students just got up and walked out. And I felt terrible. I mean, I don't mind if a couple of people walk out, they've got to cough or go to the toilet. But if whole lines go out, you know, you think, oh dear, you know, I'm doing something terribly wrong. And I was getting too close to theology for their liking. They're not ready for theology. What they want is to have the heart ignited. They want a climate of acceptance. They want their own spiritual life acknowledged. And they don't want theology. They're happy with cosmology, but not theology. And it was just too much for them, and I had to eventually apologise to a bunch of atheists who didn't want to know about the fall and redemption. And so it was a very sensitive balancing act. You can imagine, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, humanists, and a whole bunch of so-called lapsed Catholics, all together. After months of trial and error, I hit on really the important thing, which was partly being influenced by William Johnston, which was mysticism. Now, mysticism appealed to them like nothing else. Paradoxically, I'll come back to this slide in a minute. Paradoxically, I found students didn't care whether the mystics were Christian, Islamic, Jewish, or Hindu, so long as their language was not dogmatic or theological. They didn't like the way theology asserted what one student called positive knowledge of the sacred, but were enthralled by how mystics evoked the sacred. So I could teach the Christian Eckhart quite easily, they had no objection, the Hindu Kabir, the Islamic Rumi, and there would be no protest. Why was this so? It was because the mystics began with experience and not with doctrine. Now, that's not to say the mystics, of course, don't know the doctrine, they do. But they want something, as it were, prior to doctrine, which is experience of God. That's where students are at. And yes, Archbishop Little, they are pre-evangel, beyond, not quite at the point where we can evangelize. As I said to you yesterday, all these overheads will be made available on the app. Louis Dupre is an interesting character in America. He's at Yale University, a philosopher, Catholic. And he's written an article which I continually reread. It's one of the best things I've ever read. It's called Spiritual Life and the Survival of Christianity, Reflections at the End of the Millennium. It's in Cross Currents, New York. That's the URL address. You click on it and you get the whole thing for free. As far as I'm concerned, he just says it all about what's wrong with religion, what we can do about it, how we can meet the current interest in spirituality within the context of religion, and get over this, what I would call this phony war between religion and spirituality that's raging and that Sandra Snyders is so good at articulating. Today, faith requires an inner life, says Louis Dupre. And that's what I learnt from my students, that it was as it says at the top of that overhead, a call to interiority. A call to interiority. And looking at Rana again, the art of catechesis. The theological problem today, he says, is the art of drawing religion out of an individual, not pumping it into him or her. The art is to help people become what they really are. And I think that comment I found very inspiring. It's the art of drawing religion out of an individual. Now, those of you who are educators, and I know many of you here are lecturers or teachers or involved in education, the very word education, if you look at the Latin roots, educare, means to draw out what is within. And education, in education, the revolution of thought there, of course, over the last few decades has been the old-fashioned idea of taking the bottle of water and pouring it into empty heads, which is the model of education that I grew up with, I think, in the 1950s, has completely gone out. And what's in now is we've got to draw things out from people, which is what education literally means. Now, religion now has to understand this process. Clearly, Karl Rahner was onto it, as was Louis Dupre and others. Something is already there, it's latent, and it's not yet reached the stage even of language. It's pre-language. It's not only evangelical, but it's pre-language itself. Now, perhaps the Protestant traditions have more trouble with this than the Catholic ones, but I don't know. But a lot of students say to me, as soon as I talk about the God within, religious people roll their eyes and scream narcissism. you know. And I began to realise this is a real problem in Christianity, especially in what we call in Australia the Uniting Church, which is a combination of Methodists, Congregational and Presbyterian, yeah. And of course Baptists is another group, but they're not part of the Uniting Church. Public worship and community work, this is from the overhead, are good things, of course, but they're not religion in its entirety. They're half the story. They are part of the out-breath or exhalation into the world. There's also the in-breath or inhalation into the interior world. The in-breath, in Latin, inspirare, from which we derive the word inspiration, is missing in the external focus of Western religion. And youth embody this missing dimension in stark relief in their concern for meditation, interiority, and the God within. So in other words, why I think religion frequently can't talk to youth is because a side of religion has emerged that has been suppressed for so long that the religious institutions don't even recognise it as religious. It sees it as narcissism. Now what's going on here and what's going wrong? Well, the churches, and I think all of them here, are divorced from their own mystical traditions, for a start. Are divorced from the sources of mysticism, which is all about the God within. Father Lawrence often quotes that piece from Luke 17. Don't look here, don't look there for the kingdom, because the kingdom of God is within you. Also can be translated among you, I think. Is that right? Yeah. So there are various translations. And I once said that to a group of Protestants who said, is that really in the Bible? I said, have a look at Luke 17. And someone said that must have been a bad hair day for Jesus. You know? I said, a bad hair day? How can you be so disrespectful? This is central. And it's upon this idea of Luke 17 that many of the mystical traditions are founded. And so religion is so out of touch with its interiority that when a new generation rises saying, basically what they're saying, we want to find the God within or we don't want God at all. In fact, there's a beautiful line in Bertolt Brecht's play, Galileo, where Galileo says to Sagredo, God is inside us or nowhere. It's worth looking at that play, those of you who are teachers, and those of you who perhaps come from traditions where interiority is frowned upon. God is inside us or nowhere. That's what the young people are saying. And if we can acknowledge that, I don't want to say we've caught them. That sounds like Archbishop Little. If we can acknowledge that, we can draw it out, as in educare. We can draw out that what it is within, and we can then say to them, look, yes, God is within, but look, hey, have you figured out yet? God is also without. And that's, bang, that's the moment of magic. If we can do that, if we can get them to connect to something within, that's the first step, starting with the heart. Not starting with the God of the universe. It's too big for them. They can't cope with it. Too burdensome. Start with the heart. Find the, what's it called in the Old Testament? The still small voice. Is that Kings? Yeah. 1 Kings, I think. Yeah. Elijah, that's right. Elijah was expecting to find God in a thunderstorm, in an earthquake, in some cataclysmic event. And then he realised that God was the still small voice within. That's what students are after, and it's our task as educators, especially religious educators, to take them to that first port of call, the still small voice within. And obviously meditation, again, as I've been saying all through this seminar, is crucial to this process. What they don't know still is that there is a Christian tradition of meditation, because when I talk to them about meditation, their minds automatically think the East, not the West. So it's up to us, part of the World Christian community of Christian meditation to make them aware that, yes, we know this tradition got lost somehow, but luckily it's recovered its memory. The amnesia of Christianity is over, and just at the right point, in the nick of time, we're remembering interiority. And what interiority teaches us is that there's part of the inner life which is not just the personal self. And this is where the orthodox religions make their mistake. They assume that the self is entirely subjective. It isn't. There's a dimension of the self which is not subjective, which is in fact objective. Jung calls it the objective psyche. You don't have to become Jungian to understand this. You simply have to develop a sort of a mystical understanding that God touches us in our interiority. And that's what's missing, and that's why the young find they cannot connect with religious traditions. They regard religious language as not only irrelevant to them, but as actually farcical. And they think of us as talking an alien language which alienates them even more. Now, I've got two daughters, and I know exactly, how difficult this is to convey this sense. But with patience and in time, I think we can get, the Sistine Chapel, the two hands. That's the way I look at it, like God touching the hand of Adam. It's like religion can touch the hand of youth. If you look closely at the Sistine Chapel, there's actually a gap there. Mind the gap, as it says in the London subways. Mind the gap between the platform and the train. And that's what's happening at the moment. The gap is too wide and people aren't crossing it. Religion can't cross it because it says the youth are narcissistic, and the youth can't cross it because they don't understand religious language and they don't see that it's got anything to do with them. So mysticism is a key, and as I mentioned before, they don't care whether it's Eckhart, Kabir or Rumi, so long as it's engaged in experience. One student denied, which was typical. I'd go around the room and talk about their background, and they'd had all their jokes and sniggers at religion, and I'm used to that now. It's a sort of persecutory thing, and yeah, I can take it. Big enough. One student denied having faith at all at the start of the course. This was Stephen. Often the guys were harder work than the women, actually. The guys, I don't know, there's too much reality principle in them or something. Freud said men are based on the reality principle. And anyway, Stephen says it's hard to sway a convinced materialist like myself from his constant scepticism about religious matters. At least I thought it was before this course. But it's terribly hard to continue to oppose the idea of spirit, inverted commas, which suggests, what do they call them in academia? Scare marks, don't they? Which suggests he's still a bit uncertain about spirit, so he puts it in scare marks, when it's presented in poetry and inspirational writings. W.B. Yeats, I had some Eliot on the course, Mary Oliver. Do you know Mary Oliver? Yes. What a resource. I mean, she speaks to them completely. Mary Oliver of the United States. Profoundly religious, but she's doing it to non-religious audiences, and she's communicating. Les Murray in Adelaide, in Australia. James Baxter, of course, is really a good resource too. When it's presented in poetry and inspirational writings. Before the course, I blocked out religion as irrelevant to my life. It made no sense to me at all in its conventional, archaic and drab form. But when spirituality is expressed in poetry, passion and subjectivity, I come to life. I have to take another look, as these expressions are inspirational and move me in an unexpected way. Not unexpected to me, by the way. This is exactly what I expected. I now see that emotion and spirit, it's interesting that he pairs those two together, because both are of the heart, emotion and spirit, can be included in my world. And I can have such elements without straying from reality. Says this real man. You know? Probably a rugby player or something like that, you know? Straying from reality. So we've got to get the sense that the spirit is real. I mean, I know it's invisible, sort of, but you can actually, when you become mystically attuned, you can actually see the presence of God in creation. Indigenous people do. They have what Charles Taylor calls permeability. And I think that's, you know, that's what poetry aims for, that state of permeability, where you see the divine hand at work in creation. Permeability. It's a beautiful word. And of course, if we're closed, or what's the opposite of permeability? Encapsulated, I think. If we're encapsulated, we don't see. So that's Stephen. And I just thought, well done, sir. Students often said that the sense of emptiness was so strong that they were driven to spirit. Now this is an important point. At the start of teaching this course, in fact for the first 3, 4, 5 years, you might say it's a dur factor, but I actually hadn't realised that most of my students had suffered from some form of mental illness. I hadn't realised it. I mean, here's me with a background, I'm trained in psychotherapy, but I was in a different part of my brain. I was in academic land, you know, I wasn't looking for the signs. And then gradually they made hints in tutorials and small groups that they'd suffered from depression since perhaps the age of 12. A girl would say, I'd had an eating disorder and, you know, anorexia. Some boy would say, I've had anxiety disorder and that's why I sit near the door, because if I get a panic attack, excuse me, Professor, I'll have to run out. I'll say, oh, go for it, you know, no problem. I just can't go out with you, that's all, you know. Students suffering from various forms of mental illness. I looked up the statistics, and over the course of the period that I was teaching the subject, the statistics actually changed. It was 1 in 5 university students suffering from mental disorder of some kind or other. And now, I'm not sure again in New Zealand, but in Australia it's 1 in 4. 1 in 4 are suffering from either depression, anxiety, eating disorders, under-eating, overeating, chronic fatigue syndrome. And that's why Jung's comments that the gods have become diseases always rings in my ears. I think that society is paying a huge price for cutting out the religious life, and it's emerging as mental illness. That's my intuition. They were aware that their spiritual interests put them at odds with society. They were acutely aware that they were living in a time in which spirit was discounted, and they developed theories about why spirit was coming back. A lot of them said it's because of their contact with Aboriginal people, which was very moving. And one student wrote, Amber, her background she described as secular. Attitudes to spirituality have changed in recent times and have become more receptive. I don't think that it's seen as a weakness anymore to admit to the feeling that there's something missing in our lives. Isn't that moving? I just find that incredibly moving. In the modern era, to refer to the spirit, she's being academic here, she's contrasting modern with postmodern. In the modern era, which supposedly finished, according to Michel Foucault, 1965, surprise, we're no longer modern. To call attention to what was missing might have raised the ire of those of us who felt they were getting along nicely without religion or spirituality. Notice the scare marks again. Students are very tentative about these things, even as they're studying it. Today, in the postmodern world, it's more obvious that we are missing something. And to point this out is no longer seen as offensive or impolite. Isn't that incredible? So that's how far we've progressed into the secular It can be offensive to say that something is missing. Jürgen Habermas, who I mentioned yesterday in the talk on the return of the sacred, has written a book called Something is Missing. And it's a really good book about why society is becoming post-secular. Something is missing. Although the social mask is hard, it's also brittle and easily broken in times of adversity. Now, this is Caroline, and she described her family background as atheist, strongly atheist. So I wonder what her parents think now. Underneath their hardened secular shells, says Caroline, people still need to believe that there's more to their existence than just one fragile life that in the sweep of time is over in a blink of the eye. Majority of people still have faith. Now, she said even her grandparents are atheists. How is she talking this language? Where's it coming from? Or rapidly trying to recover faith in the critical and urgent moments of our lives. Now, I can just bracket that. She talked about one of her school friends being killed in a car accident. And, you know, there was flowers wrapped around the electricity pole that she unfortunately, tragically drove into. And she said there was a spontaneous outpouring of grief, and people became naturally religious for her. It was quite uncanny. People who weren't religious became religious at the time of grief, and I think that says something. And she says, this is today's reality, which is confounding to me. Why do we wait for adverse circumstances to occur before we reach out to touch the face of God and be embraced by the holy? Incredible stuff. I mean, you know, there's something at work here. There's something going on. As Beckett would write in Endgame, something is taking its course. And just leaves it. And I think something is taking its course. It's enigmatic. Now, I found students grappling with basic questions in a moving way. They would ask, in a way similar to Teresa of Avila, those of you who have been able to read The Interior Castle. Teresa, in charge of a monastery, and of course eventually founding a new order in the Carmelites, kept saying, how real is the spiritual? Because it's invisible, how real is it? And students would continually ask, what is the spiritual life? Is it a journey? What kind of journey? If so, can they trust the forces of spirit to guide them? Is such a journey real, or is it a flight of fancy, as we saw a minute ago with Stephen? This is Ambika, and you'll see at the bottom of the slide her family background is she described as humanist atheist. She writes, this should be in quotation marks, what is spirituality? The idea excites but also terrifies me. If I go in this direction, if I take this path seriously, then I have to know that it's right and true. What if I invest so much of myself, my energy, my identity, in something that proves to be completely false and unreal? That's a scary feeling. But I always come back to what feels right, even though my intellect, the head, fails to provide me with the rational answers. It cannot tell me why I need spirit at all. Sometimes when I have doubts, excuse me, I remember that the spirit is ultimately a mystery, and we can never conceptualize or understand it. If I could define God once and for all, I believe God would really be dead then. That's Meister Eckhart. That's pure Eckhart. In order to find God, we have to lose God. We have to go beyond definitions. Excuse me, we have to go beyond definitions. They're coming up with the ideas of the mystics before they've even read them. Something is taking its course. Now, students are often remarkably expressive when they write on what spirituality means to them. Here I have to confess there's a gender bias. The women are way ahead of the guys. Why is that? I don't know. guys struggle really hard with spirituality. And some guys did the spirituality course and remained resistant to the whole thing to the very end. So don't get the feeling that everybody changed or there was metanoia taking place, you know, bang, 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 bang. It wasn't true. But a lot of the women softened, opened, and shared their intimacy. One of the guys said, "I don't believe a word of this." And one of the girls stood up, one of the young women stood up in the audience, and she said, "I'm tired of hearing from you guys with all your endless skepticism." She said, "Why are you even taking this damn course?" You know? And he said, in his defence, he said, "Because I want to find out what yous believe." And another guy piped up, "It's because so many girls interested in spirituality are really good looking." And it was true. And I had to keep my eyes back on my books. This is Gorica, whose background was Serbian Orthodox. And in fact, I found a real difference between Eastern European and Western European descended students. The Eastern Europeans had much less trouble with religion, much less trouble. Then they didn't have all that Western European arrogance and prejudice and all these jaundiced ideas of religion. Because, in fact, I found out that a lot of my Eastern European students, their mothers, not their fathers, interestingly enough, were still going to church. Their mothers will still go to Serbian Orthodox or Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox. And they loved their mothers enormously in a way that a lot of Western young women don't love their mothers. They often have trouble with their mothers or conflict. But the Eastern European women loved their mothers, and they could see that they were continuing to go to church because there was something there for them that they were nourished. This is Gorica. She said, "We cannot see spirituality, therefore it's hard to believe that it exists. Those who work in the field of science, like you guys, believe what they see, so they have no belief in spirituality." Sorry, guys. Whereas those who think with their hearts and have an open mind are open to believing in spirituality. I pointed out that she's actually not right. That in fact some of the most profoundly spiritual people in the world are very much scientists. I mean, look at Einstein. You know, look at Jung. All these scientists. Science is not what they think it is. What they're thinking of is scientism, not science. True science is open to everything, including the spirit and the soul. But scientism is an ideology. It's like the secular and secularism. The secular is neutral about religion, but secularism is hostile. Feeling was emphasised over and over again. This is from Leah. And she described her background as lapsed Anglican. Spirituality, me, is a particular kind of longing. This reminds me of Teresa of Avila very much. This longing is almost an intense physical feeling that haunts me and make me ache for something. You know, I'm thinking of the Bernini sculpture, the angel with the spear. It's quite elusive, as what I long for is not immediate. I can't see or touch it. It's a longing for something that's a long way off and often leads me to melancholy. I recognise that what I long for is impossible to grasp, but the intensity of feeling is strong. I cannot provide an easy solution to this longing and recognise that the search will be long and hard. I'm hoping, I just melt when I read this. I'm hoping that this course, can you believe it, will help me understand more clearly what I'm longing for. What incredible burdens are placed on the course. She wrote this in the first week of the class. There was a 13-week semester. Now, she had the courage to read this out in class, and of course the inevitable happened. A young, insensitive man said to her publicly, "Oh, we know what you need." Yeah. And poor Leah closed up for the rest of the course. And I took her aside. I said, "Look, on behalf of the course, I'm very sorry, but this is what happens. Insensitive people say, you just need sex, lady," you know. And it just, you know, it was really damaging. And it just goes to show that even a course on spirituality is not a safe place. Not a safe place. And she said, "Well, I'm not going to read out anything in the tutorial again." I said, "I understand that, but continue with this. Continue with your distant longing, because I think you'll find that it's very real. And there's a lot of people throughout history who can speak to this." Now, this is Goritza again, the Eastern Orthodox young lady. She says, "Spirituality is like a flower that blooms when it's seen and acknowledged. The more you are able to nourish it, the stronger will your spirituality become. It doesn't matter how we actually conceptualize spirituality," she says. "What matters is that we acknowledge that it exists, and with that acknowledgement comes the support and strength of an inner life." Now, my comment to that is that students sound like Teresa or even Catherine of Siena. The importance of the imagination in cultivating an interior life, and they try to imagine a deeper life, a deeper reality into existence. Goritza goes on. I found her work really riveting. She was like a natural for this. In another age, she would have probably been a nun. "Spirituality is a kind of inner knowing. You believe in something that you haven't seen before, but somehow you know it exists." Beautiful. And then here's Joanne, who described herself as part of the great religion of lapsed Catholic. Joanne says, "By its nature, the divine is inexpressible and beyond definition. Therefore, our spirituality is always an approximation only. Spiritual knowledge is essentially intuitive, an awareness of another reality that often begins to manifest in our lived experience and deep introspection. This knowledge is often due to disillusionment with a purely profane kind of existence. Spirituality is the awakening of innate knowledge, a return to the sacred, and a desire to realise our true potential. It's the search for the hidden self, our true nature." Bravo. I mean, you know, I wasn't teaching them anything, actually. And in fact, my role was just to listen, actually. To listen to what they wanted to say. They had it all inside them, as Karl Rahner says. It's a matter of drawing out. I found this very humbling, to be in the presence of this kind of stuff. In fact, I've presented this at a conference of school teachers in Australia, and they said I'm making all these quotes up. The other day, you said my jokes were made up. And what'd you say? My stories are made up.
I said, how did you have so many ones?
But these are legitimate, bona fide quotations from real students. They're not cut and pasted from Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross. And they've had no support. They don't come from religious schools. They don't come from religious families. But they come from God. And students are reaching into their lives, this is me talking now, to find the direction that was once supplied by religion. Maybe it can again. They are looking to their interiority. Georgette has another Eastern Orthodox. She says, "Spirituality expresses itself differently for each person. But for all of us, it has the similar purpose of providing inner security in times of trouble, change, and stress." Dimitra was Greek Orthodox. It's important that we begin a spiritual quest and continue it as a lifelong search, because we ignore the inner reality at our risk and we nurture it to our distinct advantage. And a real student statement, nothing beats a cultivated soul. Isn't that great? Yay! Ambika, she was, I think, earlier she was described herself as lapsed Anglican. She says, I remain humble to my own spirituality because I find it has so much to teach me about itself and about myself. My ideas and hunches, it's a word they often use, hunches. We'd call it probably intuition. About the spirit served me for a time, yet they often prove inadequate and I have to cast them aside to take on new ideas that I'm presented with. So this is the journey motif coming up, that she's prepared to have hunches, maybe the hunch is wrong, and then she's prepared to be corrected. Now, the Canadian philosopher of religion, I believe has passed on now, Bernard Lonergan. I found this in a book, actually. Stuart Seller from University of Auckland was the one who directed me to Lonergan. Some of you might know Stuart. Yeah. The Bishop of Waikato said he was a good friend of his, a Catholic priest in Auckland, and he sent me an email across the ditch, and he said I should read The Subject by Bernard Lonergan. And on page 3, I found one sentence which has virtually become my mantra for being a spiritual educator. The fruit of the truth, this should be in quotation marks, the fruit of the truth must grow and mature on the tree of the subject before it can be plucked and placed in the absolute realm. The fruit of the truth must grow and mature on the tree of the subject, that's the human person, before it can be plucked and placed in the absolute realm, which he means religion. So truth must grow in the person. And as I said to you, was it yesterday? All the days are mixing up a bit now. You know, when I was a kid, you were given religion, and then if you were lucky, you might have an experience of the divine which would fill out and join all the dots for you. But today, they have to have the experience first, as you've seen from the quotations from all the students. And if we're patient enough and don't bark at them, bark religiosity at them, they will find their way there. It's absolutely remarkable. And as I said here, I couldn't think of a better formulation of the challenge facing all religious educators today. Western traditions want to hand people the fruit of the truth and ask them to accept it. And it doesn't work anymore. It can't work. The truth has to be grown from their experience. This is the thing that I've found. That's my last slide. Now, my final closing comment. Obviously, it involves a knack, and finding a language is the key. It's a language issue. And the knack involves opening up the interior world and the inner life, and then hoping that the students will connect to a tradition. Or, if they've lapsed out of Catholicism, or lapsed out of Anglicanism, or lapsed out of something, they can go back to what they lapsed out of and, as T.S. Eliot said, know the place for the first time. You know, we can know the place for the first time. It's that aha moment where, oh, is that what the Bible was on about? These feelings that I'm having hunches about, that's actually what the Bible is on about. Oh my God, something is speaking to me. So there's a vast gulf between dogma and experience. But when the bridge is thrown over, when we mind the gap and create something, they can walk across it to the other side. Now, something I want to say to you before I end, that over the last few years, my spirituality course got cut by the dean, who said we have no interest in spirituality. And I said, but I've been teaching this for 10 years with great effect, enormous academic credibility to the subject, great results. He said, yes, but it's not part of the faculty plan. I said, well, when would spirituality ever be part of an atheist university's plan? And I said, I know I'm doing this despite the authorities, but they can bugger off. But he said, no, I'm the authority, he said to me. And he said, I'm astonished you've got away with this. I said, excuse me, I'm a full professor of this university. This is what my research interests in, and it's what I publish on. He says, I don't care. I'm astonished you've got away with this so long, and the course is going to be cut. So this was Pontius Pilate, washing his hands and saying, out it goes. And the students got really angry. And they said, what, you're never going to make this available again? I said, that's right. It shut down. But something's happened over recent years that I've found fascinating. Nothing short of miraculous, actually. Students would sometimes knock on my door and they'd be dressed in religious clothes, looking like Father Lawrence in his Benedictine costume. But this wasn't just Christians. So I'd have Islamic students saying, thank you for the course. You've shown me how Allah, and I'd never even mentioned Allah in the whole course. You've shown me how Allah speaks to me from within, and I've connected to my tradition. A Jewish person turned up. She's now a rabbi in the Reformed Jewish tradition. A number of women have turned up with the collar. They actually become Anglican priests. And I said, don't blame me. It's not my fault. And they said, no, we come here to pay our respects to you, to thank you for what you've done. You opened up a tradition. Excuse me, I'm getting emotional. You've opened up a tradition that didn't speak to me. And now it does. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you.